Alright, so today we are testing the GeForce RTX 4070 in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty patch 2.01. Now let's just go over the settings here quickly. Currently we're at 1080p and we'll be testing on the Ultra preset first, but I'm just going to make one or two changes here because we don't want to test with the FSR. So I'm just disabling FSR. I'm just doing this a few times. So I'm going to be doing this a few times. So sorry if that annoys you. It's just sometimes it doesn't apply. And then I'm just disabling all of these post-processing effects because they just look stupid, especially on a YouTube recording. And ray tracing is disabled. Everything is on the Ultra preset, right? And the game crashes. All right, so we're back and we're still on the same settings on the Ultra preset, just with all of these disabled, right? All the post-processing effects disabled and upscaling disabled. And I'm in the same area where we were doing all the other benchmarks. This is in Dogtown at the stadium, one of the more intensive areas in the new expansion that I could find. And you can see that we are slightly CPU bound, even with a 12700K CPU. I did put up all the specs of this machine at the beginning of this video, but this is a 12700K with DDR4 4000 MHz CL18 memory, and we are CPU bound at 1080p. Now, it is more or less expected. I mean, this is a very CPU intensive area, lots of NPCs, etc. So I mean, 1080p, we're not going to be doing too much testing here because it's pointless. It's not a real GPU benchmark because we are CPU bound, right? But we will be testing just with frame generation because that also helps when you are CPU bound, right? So let's just go ahead and enable frame generation here. Hopefully the stupid game doesn't crash again. I'm just going to enable frame generation as it is without enabling DLSS super resolution. We just need to disable that. And let's see. We're getting around 95 frames per second and now getting around 130 frames per second. So if you are looking for a high refresh rate experience, then this is pretty much it, right? I know some people lose it when I say high refresh rate experience because that would include lower input latency, which you don't get with the DLSS 3 frame generation, but the motion fluidity is definitely there. Now, this will be the only two tests I'm doing at 1080p without ray tracing. So, I mean, just purely because we are CPU bound, as I said earlier, and we'll move on to 1440p at the end of this run. All right, reaching the end of the run here, and you can see we had a nice average frame rate of 144 frames per second. So if you do have a 144 hertz monitor, then this will pretty much max it out. All right, so let's go over to, let me just close that. Let's go over to 1440p here, and once again, hopefully the game doesn't crash. And we'll once again go onto the Ultra preset, right? Just without frame generation. So Ultra preset, we'll just apply that, disable DLSS, and disable all of these as well. Right, crossing my fingers here. Oh, the game didn't crash. Look at that. All right, so it looks like we are pretty much getting 60 frames per second here, right? Now, I'm testing on the Ultra preset. I don't think you should be playing on the Ultra preset. High looks plenty good and is not nearly as intensive as this. Getting around 20% frames per second increase when we go to high, which you will obviously see in the next run. But on the 1440p Ultra preset, we are struggling to maintain 60 frames per second, right? Now, this is ripe for frame generation to be enabled. If you've got around 60 frames per second, you can enable frame generation. But also at 1440p, you can enable upscaling for a slight increase in performance anyway, and reduction in input latency, and then you can enable frame generation. But as you can see, we've got 60 frames per second there, so not ideal because we couldn't really maintain it. But let's see what happens once we go down to the high preset here. Right, once again, just disabling all of this. I'm just going to toggle it a few times to make sure it's off, and all of these you can just skip ahead. All right, so now we're on the high preset, and we went from 60 frames per second to 66 frames per second. So 10% performance increase here. And in my previous testing, we didn't drop below 60 frames per second at all. Cyberpunk is perfectly playable at 60 frames per second. It is quite a demanding game. It is a first-person shooter, but on a high refresh rate monitor with the VRR enabled variable refresh rate, 60 frames per second feels pretty good. And especially in this specific area, as I said, it's one of the more intensive areas in this new patch or new expansion. And you'll get much better frame rates outside of the city, but I just wanted to test the worst case scenario, right? So let's just see. I mean, we can go down to medium here even at 1440p. It still looks pretty good. We'll just disable FSR there and motion blur and all that kind of stuff. The only reason why I disable the post-processing effects is just because it looks terrible in the YouTube videos. Right, so now we went from around 66 to around 80 frames per second, and you can definitely feel it. The mouse input just feels a lot more responsive, and that'll make sense because your input latency does go down when your frame rate goes up. And this is definitely not a bad experience, right? But if you don't mind sacrificing slight visual quality, you can enable DLSS set to quality on the high preset, and that's pretty much what I do. 1440p is enough of a base resolution for you to be able to enable DLSS quality without much visual compromise, and then you just slap on frame generation on top of that, and it's pretty good. Alright, so that was just an autosave stutter there, but so just look at the 1% and 0.1% lows before that, but we had an average here of 82 frames per second, which is pretty decent. Right, so let's just, I'm just going to do one test here, one more test. I mean, I'm just going to, let's just disable that. We'll go onto the high preset. We'll enable DLSS frame generation, and we'll set it to quality. There it goes back to auto, so just go back to quality. Disable all these kind of things, and no ray tracing, right? So this is on the high preset, DLSS super resolution set to quality, and DLSS frame generation enabled. And I do think the game is going to crash now. I made too many graphical changes here, and it didn't. Right, so now you can see we pretty much doubled our frame rate coming from native. At native we were getting around 66 frames per second. Now we are getting 130 frames per second, so double that. And as I said, you are obviously having to play at a lower internal resolution, but DLSS quality is perfectly fine in this game at 1440p. I'd say in this specific game, even DLSS quality at 1080p is okay. I'm not a big fan of using upscaling at 1080p. Obviously, there will be some visual artifacts, but as you can see, if you move fast enough, like if you're going to pixel peep, you're going to notice it. But if you just move around, play the game, you probably won't notice it anyway. This is how I play the game on this specific system. As I mentioned in some of my previous videos, I actually test all the GPUs that I do benchmark videos on. I put them in my main system for a few weeks to get a pretty good idea of what the GPUs are capable of. And currently the 4070 is in my main system, and these are the settings that I play at the moment. Alright, so let's move over to 4K. I'm going to be doing the ray trace testing after all of this because I don't want the game to crash that often. So let's just bump this up to 4K. Right, you'll see that MSI Afterburn is slightly smaller, so I'm just going to increase that. I'll be right back. Right, so at 4K, let's start off on the high preset. There's no point in us going to the ultra preset at 4K. Right, you'll see that FSR super resolution gets enabled anyway, so we'll just disable that. And once again, just disable all of these, right? So this is on the 4K native high preset. Right, let's see what happens here. And this is not good. I mean, the game looks pretty good. It's very sharp. It really does look good at 4K. It's just not playable at 4K unless you really want 30 frames per second, right? So you can actually lock it to 30 frames per second. You should be able to maintain 30 frames per second at all times. And what I did see is that if you enable motion blur, the game feels a lot less choppy. I'm not a big fan of motion blur, but that's one case where I saw that it does help, is when you have very low frame rates like over here. But I wouldn't advise playing at 4K high native anyway. We'll play around with the different presets and upscaling, etc. Right, so for now, let's just drop this down to the medium preset, because I do think we'll gain quite a lot of performance here just by doing that. So let's just make sure that it is disabled and that kind of stuff. So there's the settings. It's now on 4K medium, still a native, right? And maybe we gained 10-20% frames per second. 20% sounds a lot until you realize it's 6 frames per second when your base frame rate is 30. So I mean, sure, it does help, but I mean, it'll get us closer to that minimum of 50 frames per second before we enable frame generation. So it means that we can basically use DLSS quality or maybe DLSS balanced at worst to get closer to 60 frames per second, and then we'll enable frame generation, and then it's not a bad experience. I know a lot of people complain about input latency when it comes to frame generation, but if your base frame rate is high enough in a game like this, it really doesn't bother me too much. Alright, so 41 frames per second at 4K medium native, not a terrible result. The 4070 is pretty much on par with the 3080, remember. Right, so let's just get rid of that. We're going to be on the same preset. I actually had motion blur enabled there. Sorry about that. Anyway, so we'll just do DLSS super resolution on quality. Let me just disable all of this anyway. Alright, so still on the medium preset, just DLSS quality, so no longer 4K native, but I do think we'll be close to 60, and this is actually, this is surprising, right? This is the same as what we had at 1440p on the high preset native, so, and it looks good. I mean, DLSS quality, even balanced at 4K, you can go down as low as DLSS performance in this game, at 4K before you actually start noticing like obvious artifacts. As I said, if you're going to Pixel Peep, you will definitely see artifacts, some light flickering, some ghosting effects, etc. But just playing the game, definitely won't notice it. And this is actually a pretty good experience. If you've got a 4K 60 Hz monitor, then these are the settings to play at. Alright, so now that we got 60 frames per second, I'm going to leave it on the medium preset. I think 4K medium is the way to go. DLSS set to quality. Right, so we might bump this up to balanced, but let's enable frame generation here and do quality as well. Just make sure that it stays to quality. And let's reset our numbers here. Alright, so 4K on the medium preset, DLSS set to quality, frame generation enabled. It's a pretty good experience, although I probably wouldn't play with frame generation if the main output or the final output is around 75 frames per second. Like, it's not really filling up your high refresh rate monitor, so we might need to just use DLSS balance to get like above 100 frames per second, maybe, right? And it'll just be a bit of a better experience when it comes to motion fluidity. So in this case, I don't think it's worth it to enable frame generation. 4K 60 is definitely as playable as a 4K 75, in my opinion anyway. So I think let's bump the DLSS super resolution up to performance, yeah, not performance, balanced. Right, so I think we should get close to 90 frames per second here. And for those of you who think that this doesn't make a difference, I mean, some people still can't see the difference between 60 Hz and 144 Hz. To those people, I mean, 4K 60 is perfectly fine. We're still not getting a, well, what we would classify as a high refresh rate experience, but we are staying above 80 here at all times, pretty much touching the 90s there. So if you really want a high refresh rate experience, you'll have to go down to DLSS performance, probably, maybe even ultra performance. But at this point, this is pretty fine. I wouldn't mind playing like this. That's just my opinion. Alright, so let's move on to the ray tracing testing. Right, we're going to go down back to 1080p, right? Let's start off on the ultra preset. No DLSS or no FSR there. Once again, just these stupid things disabled. And we'll just enable ray traced medium settings, right? So my medium settings consist of enabling all ray traced options and just lighting to medium, no path tracing at the moment. Right, so this is at native 1080p. Whoops. Now it's at native 1080p, no frame generation, no DLSS upscaling or anything. And this is not going to be the best experience, I can tell you that. Our numbers are quite big. Let me just fix that quickly. So let's restart our frame rate counter there. So we're getting 40s here at 1080p with ray tracing at native, right? Definitely not the best experience, and like it's not worth it to me at this resolution, at these settings, to be running ray tracing, right? I mean, the performance hit is definitely not ideal. We're getting like less than half our initial frame rate. I know that run was a lot shorter than previously, but you get the idea. So at 1080p, you definitely still need some upscaling here, and I do think that quality should be fine. So if we do DLSS super resolution quality here, let's reset our numbers. And now, I mean, that almost doubled our frame rate anyway. Like maybe not doubled, but you get the idea. It's going from 40 to sometimes 80. Okay, but around 60 to 70, and the motion fluidity is definitely much improved, as is the input latency, because obviously we're getting a much higher frame rate. Now this is definitely much more playable. If your main aim is 60 frames per second, then definitely the way to go. I think there will be some visual anomalies, especially at this resolution with DLSS super resolution. It'll be true with any upscaling for that matter, but I mean, it is what it is. When you want to enable ray tracing, especially all ray traced options, then you will have to make some compromises. All right, once again, this is a high enough base frame rate for us to enable frame generation here. Just make sure that your DLSS setting is the same, and I mean, now it should be a good experience. We went from 80 frames per second to 110 frames per second. I think it'll average maybe 120, depending on how long we stay in this specific area. So once again, we went from 40 frames per second to 120 frames per second just by enabling DLSS super resolution quality and then enabling frame generation, right? And that's where NVIDIA's stupid 3 times performance number comes from. They usually compare it with native no upscaling, no frame generation to DLSS super resolution and frame generation. So I mean, this is why we do these videos, so you can basically just see what the actual performance is like. All right, so average of 114 frames per second, and I don't think that's terrible at all. All right, but now for the big one, right? We're going to leave the exact same settings, right? Except we're going to enable path tracing here. Hopefully the game doesn't crash now. Now, I just need to note that now with path tracing, we do get DLSS ray reconstruction. We'll toggle that independently. And with the latest 2.01 update, apparently they did increase the visuals or improve the visuals when you use more aggressive upscaling. I didn't find that to be particularly true, but we'll get to that right now. So the same settings as previously, we had around 110 frames per second, except now we don't have ray tracing set to medium. We now have ray tracing set to path tracing, and this will be particularly intensive, right? So getting in the mid 60s. So we basically halved our frame rate again just by enabling path tracing. Now the input latency is pretty bad at this point because our final output is around 60 frames per second. So our base frame rate would be below 50 frames per second. And I mean, this is just not the best experience. Path tracing has a long way to go. If you want to enable path tracing, you'd need a much better GPU, a much more powerful GPU. I'd say 4070 Ti is probably the lowest GPU I would enable path tracing on. That's just my personal opinion anyway. It's just that the sacrifices to run path tracing is just not worth it to me at this point on anything lower than a 4070 Ti. All right, so let's just see if we can do something about the input latency. So let's just go to balanced, and now you'll see that it wants to enable DLSS ray reconstruction. Stupid. Right, so DLSS balanced. It went up to around 90 frames per second, but the input latency, sorry if I'm making you dizzy, still feels slightly weird. Definitely still playable, but I don't know, it's not as responsive. Even compared to just normal ray tracing, even if we adjust the settings so we get more or less the same frame rate with frame generation enabled, it does feel a little bit more sluggish on this GPU when path tracing is enabled, right? You can see we getting an average of 91 frames per second, but the input latency would disagree completely. So path tracing, I think, definitely left to higher end GPUs. But that's not all we'll be testing at path tracing. I actually have a few issues here with path tracing that I'll show you at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. But one thing that we can do is we can enable DLSS ray reconstruction, and this is supposed to make ray tracing a little bit more accurate, a little bit nicer. It's like just a much better denoiser, and in Cyberpunk it actually does increase the performance slightly, although it's not necessarily meant to increase the performance. In Cyberpunk it's just that the regular ray trace, the denoisers, do take a little bit of processing power, or take more processing power than DLSS ray reconstruction, right? So this is what it enabled, and I mean, if you want to play like this, you definitely can. It does feel slightly better now, especially the mouse input. Previously it wasn't the worst. I'd be able to play like that. It's just that I'd prefer not to, and it is quite a lot to sacrifice when it comes to visuals, right? I don't think DLSS set to balanced at 1080p is the best way to play. Just enable better lighting and reflections. But I mean, that's just my opinion. You can do whatever you want. But I think that's it for our 1080p results. Now let's move over to 1440p. Alright, so 1440p on the high preset, native resolution, ray tracing, medium. No frame generation, no nothing. Alright, and while it looks pretty good, the performance is questionable. I mean, we're not getting 30 frames per second here, and definitely not how I would like to play this game. Sure, it looks good, but I'm an FPS snob, or a frame rate snob, not a first-person shooter snob, and that as well, but that's neither here nor there. It does look pretty good if you stand still and look at stuff. In motion, it's just terrible. The choppiness of the low frame rate definitely comes through, and it's not a good experience, this. And once again, if you do enable motion blur, this it would smooth over it slightly, although I'd recommend not playing on these settings, right? This is just to get a baseline. I'm not saying you should play at these settings anyway. So let's just play around a bit with the DLSS super resolution, yeah. So I don't think quality is going to cut it here for us. Let's just see what our frame rate is. So 45 frames per second, DLSS balanced, and close enough to 60. So if you are aiming for 60 frames per second and you don't mind the occasional dip below 60, that was another autosave. This game autosaves a lot. If you don't mind the occasional dip below 60 frames per second, then this is definitely fine. I mean, this is without frame generation. Able to the input latency is pretty okay. Nothing wrong to report there. But we're not getting a constant 60 frames per second experience, and not what I'd call an ideal experience. Now, I am a little bit surprised because the 4070, as I mentioned before, is pretty much on par with the 3080, and I would expect slightly better ray tracing performance from it. So if you do want to use extensive ray tracing with a 4070, I think 1080p is probably best, although it's definitely a 1440p card. It's just not the best experience once you enable like all these ray traced options, right? So let's just enable frame generation at exactly the same settings, which is DLSS quality and frame generation enabled. And now we're getting around 90 frames per second, and you can definitely feel there's a slight delay in the input latency. Once again, I don't mind that at all, unless it's really noticeable. If you've seen some of my previous videos, I'm a big advocate of frame generation, FSR frame generation, NVIDIA frame generation. It doesn't really matter to me. I just want a higher frame rate. I want the motion fluidity of a high refresh rate experience, and that's pretty much what frame generation can offer you, right? And this actually does feel pretty good, I must say. So maybe DLSS is set to balanced on R2 medium with frame generation enabled. It'll give you a good experience. All right, so now we get to the big leagues once again. Let's just enable path tracing. The exact same settings, right? Path tracing, no array reconstruction, DLSS set to balanced, and frame generation enabled. Okay, so it's on the high preset more or less. And I don't think this is going to be a good experience. I mean, sure, our final, oops, that disappeared. Our final frame rate is 60 frames per second, but there's such a big delay in the mouse movement here. Very, very, very laggy. Input latency is terrible. This, even though, as I said, I'm an advocate of frame generation, this I won't be able to play like the input latency really is terrible. It feels like I'm gliding. There's no responsiveness, or there's no direct responsiveness whatsoever once I move the mouse. So, I mean, this is just to get a baseline. Path tracing is extremely demanding, and I don't think it's suited for the 4070 unless you want to play at 30 frames per second. But let's see what we need to do to actually get a decent enough frame rate and a decent enough response time. So what we can do is we can just go down to the medium preset, right? And leave frame generation enabled. We'll use DLSS on performance, okay? And we'll use, why is ray reconstruction gone now? Oh, that's why, because we toggled the preset. So I'll just use path tracing, okay? So now we're pretty much in the same settings as previously. On the medium preset, frame duration enabled, DLSS super resolution set to performance, and path tracing enabled as well. All right, so let's just see. It does still feel not great. Right, so going from DLSS balance to DLSS performance gain is another 10 frames per second outside, another 15 frames per second inside maybe. Inside, the input latency is definitely much better than outside because the frame rate is much higher inside. At the moment it starts dipping below 70 frames per second, the final output there. It starts to feel very sluggish, right? Not ideal. I know you have to take my word for it. There's no latency meter up on the screen at the moment, but it doesn't feel good. So then I'm guessing ultra performance is our only bet here. I mean, let's just leave array reconstruction disabled here for now. All right, so okay, so ultra performance getting us 110 frames per second. The input latency, I know I'm moving it around quite a lot, but now you can just see like this just looks broken, right? Just look at the piping there. It's, I mean, all the shimmering, everything is just broken. Like this is definitely not how you want to play this. How you want to play this game at all, right? And that's where array reconstruction comes in, just to have a look at how much it stabilizes the image now. Okay, so in that sense it's great, but I mean it can't perform miracles. It's definitely not ideal. I mean, this guy looks like he's walking through wax. Anyway, so path tracing at 1440p on a 4070, I'd give it a skip, really. I would. I know some people might not mind playing at this. Let me just reset the numbers there, sorry. Some people might not mind playing like this. I do. It just looks not good at all. I mean, we are at ultra performance, so the internal resolution is extremely low, and then it's slapping on path tracing on top of that. Like it's trying to do too much with a lower base internal resolution, right? Just look at his hair, all the shimmering there. Like this is definitely not how this game was intended to be played, right? And that's why I say path tracing is best left for more powerful GPUs. All right, so let's just see what we need to do to get ray tracing playable at 4K. All right, so we're now at 4K once again on the medium quick preset, but I'm just going to disable all the upscaling tech here for now and just enable ray tracing here at the bottom. And first, a few things we need to do, and then ray tracing once again just on medium, everything enable, the lighting set to medium, and I think that's about it, right? So 4K medium native with ray tracing, and I think yeah, this is great. This is great. It's climbing, getting 10 frames per second. At the start we were getting 4 frames per second, and definitely definitely unplayable at this point, right? You can even see the GPU power there is dipping below. I mean, it's supposed to be doing like 200 watt. It's dipping below 150 even at times. I don't know, something's not right here. Anyway, we shouldn't be doing ray tracing at 4K anyway. So let's start it off with the DLSS super resolution set to ultra performance, okay, and see if we can get a decent 4K experience. I know it's not 4K, but the output resolution is 4K, right? So getting 60 frames per second here, and I'm impressed. Sure, you have to contend with all of that. Just look at the background there. And that's just what ultra performance will do for you, or do to your image quality. But at least we're getting 60 frames per second with a ray tracing at 4K. Not too terrible, and without frame generation, the input latency is pretty good. So not the worst experience this, but not the best looking either. Now, I don't think you should be playing at 4K with the 4070, especially not with ray tracing enabled. So I'm not going to be doing too many tests here. Path tracing will be terrible. So let's just enable frame generation here quickly, and DLSS ultra performance. Oh, stop it. Just to see what the highest frame rate is we can get. And we're getting 80 frames per second. Okay, so I'm not going to be wasting too much time here. Getting 80 frames per second with the frame generation enabled. And now if we leave all the settings as is, I mean, this is pretty much as low as it can go. Sure, you can dial a lot of these settings down. I mean, it's just on the medium preset, but the resolution is as low as it can go, the internal resolution. And let's enable path tracing and see if we can get anything going here at 4K. I mean, getting 60 frames per second, not terrible. It looks terrible. I'm not going to lie. I don't know if this is coming through in like that girl's face. Like, there's no texture on her face whatsoever. This guy doesn't have a nose. Like, I don't know, this is pretty broken at this stage, right, with path tracing enabled. So let's just enable array reconstruction here and see. I mean, it does stabilize the image sometimes, right? The reflections will be much better, and some things are definitely more stable, but just look at this guy's face. Like, if we get closer to it, you can see it a little bit. I mean, you can see his face a lot more clear. The moment you move away slightly, it looks like his face is wrapped in like a glad wrap or something, and just all the ghosting. I mean, this is just terrible. But that's not what I want to show you when it comes to path tracing. I actually want to show you at a resolution like 1440p. I'm not sure if it's just my side. Something seems to be completely broken. This is even after the update, which is supposed to improve performance of or improve visual fidelity on higher upscaling settings with DLSS ray reconstruction. So I'm just going to go back down to 1440p, and I'll show you this in a specific area. Right, we're now back at 1440p. This is just on the high preset, right? Just without any upscaling, all this kind of nonsense disabled, and no ray tracing, right? I just want to show you why I'm not playing with ray tracing on this GPU. Right, so we are here outside at Longshore Stacks, right? Still in Dogtown, and just at the 1440p high preset, and everything looks pretty decent. We're getting 60 frames per second, right? And I want you to note two things there, right? The candles there, these candles commemorate the dead, and this gun. Okay, it's a very reflective gun, that's why I'm using it. And at these settings, and if we get it into the light, it looks pretty decent, right? Like, it really does. So now if we want to enable, let's just enable normal ray tracing, okay, and we get it to a point where we are happy with the performance. Okay, so all these ray traced options enabled, the medium preset or medium lighting, and we'll use DLSS Super Resolution Balanced. Okay, this should get us close to 60 frames per second. Okay, so the candles, you can still see them. They still look pretty good. Just look at the gun, especially when there's shadows crossing over it. Not the best looking gun at all. Like a lot of artifacting and a lot of noise. Okay, now it's just one example, but I'll elaborate on this example right now. I mean, I don't know if you can see it. It's very pixelated, very blocky in certain areas, especially there. Okay, like it's not great. Okay, and if you see this across your screen the whole time playing with this shotgun, then I mean it does become very distracting. Okay, so even though we're not getting a very high frame rate, we can go ahead and enable frame generation here, right? So we get a decent frame rate. But I wanted to show you what it looks like without frame generation. Okay, and it looks even worse with frame generation. Okay, so not the best looking, right? But the candles, they still look pretty okay. So now if we go with the exact same settings, we enable path tracing. Okay, I hope the game doesn't crash now because it just did previously. Okay, so we're getting 50 frames per second. It doesn't look good at all. Let's just disable frame generation there. Okay, so now it's just DLSS balanced at 1440p. And once again, in the light, the reflections, the gun, everything looks pretty good. Okay, in the shadows, I think it does look better than previously, but still not the best when it comes to noise. Now, yes, you can attribute this to DLSS set to balanced, okay, because you are rendering internally at a much lower resolution. But if we then go ahead and enable ray reconstruction, right? So just look at the candles. Now all of a sudden they are flickering. Okay, if we stand over here, and this has got nothing to do with the DLSS. I mean, sure, the combination with DLSS and ray reconstruction is the problem here. If we disable ray reconstruction, okay, it's stable. And that's pretty strange to me. I mean, it's not the only thing that becomes unstable, right? But there we go with the DLSS ray reconstruction. That just looks terrible. Right, so then if we just want a slightly better frame rate, we'll enable DLSS Super Resolution Performance, right? The frame generation is still disabled because I want to keep that out of the equation. And you can see that the flickering actually increases, right? And the moment we disable ray reconstruction, it's stable. Okay, so definitely still a lot of issues here with ray reconstruction in this game. So path tracing on this 4070, definitely not what I would recommend. Now I'm going to see if I can get another example here. Just look at her face. I mean, it looks like it's wrapped in glad wrap. It's look at the ghosting. It's that just looks terrible. I mean, that's not what it's supposed to do. And then if we disable ray reconstruction, like her face becomes a lot more stable. Okay, it still doesn't look great, but at least a lot of the ghosting is gone. Okay, so I mean, there's very little detail on her face. And then if we do enable ray reconstruction, yeah, like there's definitely something wrong. It just looks completely off. Even though we're getting 50 frames per second, this is without frame generation. Anything in movement just looks really, really weird. And as I said, these aren't the only examples. And sure, yes, it is due to it being upscaled so much, right? But if you want to get a playable frame rate, you unfortunately have to use aggressive upscaling if you enable path tracing, right? And path tracing or ray reconstruction is only available once you start using path tracing in Cyberpunk. I know they said they might fix it or they will fix it, I don't know, but at this point in time, ray reconstruction can only be enabled when path tracing is enabled. So I just want to test one thing. If I do go to quality, whether those candles, like even on quality, the candles still flicker, right? So we're getting a very terrible frame rate. Like we get closer, it's no longer flickering, but right. So that's just my findings. Sure, it definitely has advantages, But at the moment, the disadvantages just outweigh the advantages for me personally. And that's why I don't play with path tracing with the 4070. Anyway, I know this has been a much longer video. These are just my thoughts. I mean, you can use whichever settings you want. I just wanted to show you what I experience and explain where I'm coming from. And that's going to be it. Right. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. And as always, we hope to see you in the next one.